Montgomery County, Virginia is the land of contradictions. Half of it sits on the Appalachian Plateau and half of it doesn't. Right now, I'm standing at one of the lowest elevations in the county. I'm in Elliston at 1,300 feet. Behind me is Poor Mountain. It's the highest point in the county. Its elevation is 3,900 feet, 3 times the elevation of Elliston. In fact, the elevation of Poor Mountain is a lot closer to Denver, Colorado's 5,200 feet than Elliston's 1,300 feet. Because of the difference of elevations, there's 2 different water systems. This is the Roanoke River. It flows through Elliston and it's going to go to the Atlantic Ocean. On the other side of the county is the New River. Now this will flow up into the Ohio, then the Mississippi, ultimately hitting the Gulf of Mexico in New Orleans. The original plan was to build a canal to connect the 2 waterways, and they were going to have a lock system to raise the boats up the mountain. But that idea got scrapped. About 20 years later, following the same route, they built these train tracks. The junction of the Little River and the New River is where the canal was supposed to meet it. But when they were laying the railroad, they decided to have that junction a couple miles downstream, where Pepper's Ferry was. That put the railroad tracks running right at the base of Price's Mountain. Now a man born on Price's Mountain, just a couple miles from this coal tipple here, he's going to be another contradiction. So let me ask you this. Can you be so bad that the world becomes a better place because of it? Welcome to Coal Hollow Road, where evil made evil. I'm Johnny Ashley in the Hood in the Woods, your neighborhood backwoods history and travel channel. You can find me on Facebook as The Real Hood in the Woods and on Instagram as Abandoned in Appalachia. Now if you'd like to help me out and help yourself out too, you should get the official copy of the Hood in the Woods books, Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. The link will be in the description. Another thing in the description will be a link to my other YouTube channel, The Family Court Guy.
This is Nellie Viola Dixon Lucas. She was born in 1888 in Blue Sulphur Springs, Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Her full-time job was being a mentally unstable lady of the evening with a fondness of the drink. Her 7 oldest children had been rescued by the state by the time her 2 youngest were born. The youngest of those 2 children was Henry Lee Lucas, and he was born on August 23, 1938. He was born and raised in a dirt-floor log cabin on Coal Hollow Road. Besides his mom, he lived with his older brother, Andrew Preston, and their dad, Anderson Lucas. Anderson had worked for the railroad until he was injured. After that, and to support his own habit, he became a moonshiner.
Half of Price's Mountain has a Christiansburg mailing address, and the other half has a Blacksburg address. Since he was born on the side that had the Blacksburg address, he would have gone here, to Price's Fork Elementary.
Henry's mother began sending him to school wearing girls' clothes, and she continued to do so until the teachers complained. She would also dress him like a girl and force him to work her lady of the evening job with her. Also, when he was 7, his brother Andrew cut Henry's eye and nose with a knife, and Henry was sent to the hospital in Roanoke. His mother only visited him once. After returning to school, a teacher hit him in the eye with the ruler, rupturing it. Henry would have to wear a glass eye for the rest of his life. In this yearbook picture, you can see he's missing an eye. When Henry was 8, his mother began forcing him to watch her have relations with her clients and her boyfriend, Bernie Dowdy. She also hit him in the head with a 2x4, splitting his scalp to the bone. He lay there for days before anyone took him to the hospital. His mother refused to feed him or even let him sleep in the house. He would stay in the chicken coop and eat paint chips off the wall. When the school complained about the smell, she took him down to the creek and violently washed him. Another time, a neighbor gave Henry a pet mule, but when he brought it home, his mom unalived it in front of him. When Henry was 10, he began helping his dad run the family still, and soon he developed a fondness for the drink too, after frequently testing the product. Bernie, his mom's boyfriend, began teaching Henry how to inflict unnecessary pain on livestock before slaughtering it, and also to fornicate the corpses post-mortem.
These train tracks crossed Coal Hollow Road. In 1947, when Henry was 11, his dad Anderson passed out on the train tracks. He was awoken when a train came, and he lost his legs. After that, people called him No-Leg Lucas, and he made a living selling pencils at the train station.
Like many teenage boys, by the time he was 13, he was obsessed with the birds and the bees. Unlike many teenage boys, though, he began having relations with his half-brother, as well as fornicating the corpses of deceased animals. When Henry was 14, his dad died of hypothermia after passing out in a snowstorm. After his father's death, Henry tried to escape his abusive mother by hitchhiking to his half-sister's house.
This brick building behind me is the Alcatraz of the Appalachians, aka the Montgomery County Jail. A few months later, he returned to Montgomery County, where he was jailed for reckless driving. The next year, at age 15, Henry claims to have committed his first unaliving when he violated Laura Burnley of Lynchburg. She was never found. In 1952, Henry and several of his stepbrothers were arrested for burglary, and Henry was sentenced to the Beaumont Reformatory. Before he could get sent to the reformatory, though, he escaped from the Alcatraz of the Appalachians. He spent a few weeks on the run before he decided to turn himself in.
The reformatory was the first time Henry got to experience living the high life, with its fancy electric lights and indoor plumbing. He was also evaluated by hospital staff and determined to have an IQ score of 76. A year later, he was released, and he drifted around from sibling to sibling, whoever would let him stay. During this time, Henry stayed with his sister Nora. He would later confess to violating her 12-year-old daughter. Soon he was arrested for a string of burglaries in the Richmond area, but now he was 18, and he was sentenced to 4 years in the state pen. Halfway through his sentence, in 1956, Henry and another inmate ran off from their work crew. In Kentucky, they stole a car, and they drove it to his sister Opal's house in Ohio. While in Ohio, he met a girl named Stella. He was also caught driving that stolen car, and given 18 months in Ohio for driving a stolen car across state lines. Then he was sent back to Virginia to finish his original sentence. During this time, he was pen pals with Stella. He also continued doing his favorite thing to do in the pokey, which was playing the hokey pokey with the other inmates. The year after he escaped, in 1957, his brother Andrew Preston died in a logging accident in California. The world was a safer place for 3 years. Then Henry got released from prison. He headed back to Opal's house, who had moved from Ohio to Michigan. He also got engaged to Stella, a relationship his mother did not approve of. His mom, who was now 60, went up to Michigan to visit them for Christmas. Her lady of the evening job didn't pay as good as it used to, and she wanted Henry to come back to Montgomery County and take care of her. It was an offer that he would refuse. On January 11th, 1960, Henry claims to have come home from a night of drinking and passed out, until he was awakened by his mom whacking him with a broomstick. Henry decided that was going to be the last day that he took his mom's abuse, and he unalived her. After she was unalived, he made love to her body. Henry fled Michigan, but was returned 8 days later when he was arrested for hitchhiking in Ohio. Henry was found guilty and sentenced to 20 to 40 years. A year into his stay, prison staff intercepted a letter that Henry had sent to his sister Opal, hinting that he wanted to unalive himself. The staff evaluated him, and they found he had a low IQ, depression, and an acute situational upset in a person with borderline intelligence. In a later interview, he said that he heard voices and tried to open his wrists. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sent to the state hospital for the criminally insane. He stayed there for 4 years. Then, in 1966, at the age of 30, he was transferred back to the state prison. In 1970, 10 years after being sentenced to 20 to 40 years, Henry was given an early parole due to prison overcrowding. He moved to Maryland and stayed with his sister Nora. Things didn't work out for him there, and he headed back to Michigan to stay with Opal. The next year he was convicted in Michigan for trying to take 2 teen girls from a bus stop using his Second Amendment rights. Henry was sentenced to 4 to 5 years, and he served 3.5 of it. Released in 1975, he claimed he begged prison staff not to make him leave because he was a danger to society. Soon after his release, he moved in with Betty Crawford, his nephew's widow, and her 3 daughters, who he soon began violating. It didn't last long, and soon Henry began drifting around the South. In 1976, Henry met Otis Elwood Toole when they were standing in line together in a soup kitchen in Jacksonville, Florida. Otis had had as rough as a childhood as Henry, and they had lots more in common. They both had low IQs. They were both drifters with the fondness of the drink, and while locked up, they both played hokey pokey with the other inmates. Henry claimed to have committed his first unaliving when he was 15, and Otis claimed his when he was 14. Henry already had been to prison for unaliving, and Otis was already the prime suspect in 2 unalivings. They drifted around the country and returned to Jacksonville when Otis' mother died. They took her car and her grandchildren that lived with her, a boy named Frank and a girl named Becky Powell. Becky had recently run away from a state girls' school and had began having relations with Henry when she was 12. In 1981, Henry, Otis, and Becky climbed into a beat-up Oldsmobile and headed west. 2 weeks later, they reached Texas. Otis was already tired of being on the road, and he headed back to Jacksonville. Henry and Becky pressed on, selling blood for gas money. Eventually, they ran out of gas and began hitchhiking. A truck driver named Jack Smart stopped and picked them up, and ended up taking them back to his house in Hemet, California. Henry and Becky stayed with the Smarts for 4 months. Later, the Smarts told the police that Henry was never out of their sight for more than 1 day. Jack's wife was called O'Bara, and she had an elderly mother called Kate Rich, who lived on a chicken farm in Ringgold, Texas. Turns out that Kate needed some help on her farm, so the Smarts gave Henry and Becky some cash, bought them a couple of bus tickets, and off to Texas they went. Kate had another daughter that lived nearby, and she took an immediate disliking of Henry and Becky. She claimed they were spending too much of Kate's money, slept too much, and weren't properly caring for her mom. Eventually they got kicked off of Kate's farm and ended up a few miles down the street at a religious retreat called the House of Prayer. It was run by Reverend Moore, and he gave Henry and Becky an apartment in a remodeled chicken coop. 47-year-old Henry was happy to be there, but 14-year-old Becky wasn't, and she wanted to go back to Jacksonville. Hitchhiking, they made it as far as Denton before nightfall. There, they camped in a field near the highway. The next morning, Henry returned to the House of Prayer and told them that Becky had run off with the truck driver. 3 weeks later, Henry went to Kate's chicken farm, where he told her a different story than he had told the House of Prayer. He told her that Becky had run off and asked for Kate's help finding her. Kate agreed, but in a secluded place, Henry unalived her. Then, he stuffed her into a drainage pipe. After Kate was found, Henry was on top of the suspect list, so the police went and shook him down and found out he was carrying a concealed weapon. He was arrested, and in custody, he confessed to unaliving Becky and Kate. He showed investigators where he had buried Becky's remains in that field near Denton. While he was being arraigned, Henry stunned the courtroom when he asked, "Well, what we gonna do about the other 100 women I killed?" The Texas Department of Public Safety had the Texas Rangers set up a task force that controlled access to Henry, while detectives from around the country came to interview him about their cold cases. To keep Lucas in a talkative mood, the task force took very good care of him. His cell was carpeted. He had a color TV with cable. He ate homemade meals and had an endless supply of cigarettes and his favorite, strawberry milkshakes. When Henry wasn't confessing to cold case detectives, he was granting interviews with the media, and his endless supply of grisly details produced the most captivating headlines. It kept reporters coming back for more. Henry claimed to have unalived more people than any other unaliver. Many of the crimes Henry was admitting to, he claimed to have committed with his buddy Otis. Otis had had a tough time after he got back to Florida. In April 1983, he was arrested for arson in Jacksonville and sentenced to 20 years. While in prison in Florida, Otis confessed to the January 1982 unaliving of 65-year-old George Sonnenberg. They had been having relations with each other, but after an argument, Otis barricaded George's door in the boarding house that he lived in and set the whole place on fire. Then, in October 1983, Otis confessed to the 1981 unaliving of 6-year-old Adam Walsh. Adam's mother had gone to Sears in Miami, suburb of Hollywood, Florida, looking for a lamp that she had seen on sale, and she left her son at a kiosk where several other young boys were taking turns playing Atari. When she returned, the boys were gone, and when she asked, she was told that the boys had been kicked out of the store after a scuffle over whose turn it was to play next. She had the store page him and looked for him outside, but he was nowhere to be found. An hour and a half after he was first noticed missing, his mother called the police. 2 weeks later, And 130 miles away, the severed head of a little boy was found in a Vera Beach drainage ditch that ran along Interstate 95, the road connecting Miami to Jacksonville. The next day, the head was identified as Adam Walsh. The rest of his body was never discovered. That's just 2 of the 109 unalivings Otis confessed to, but that's nothing compared to Henry's 360, and he was still going strong. He wasn't just claiming every unaliving in the country. After the Royal Canadian Mounted Police talked to him, he confessed to 26 unalivings in Canada. Henry confessed to 8 unalivings throughout the country that happened during the 4 months that the Smarts said that he was in California with them. The task force was taking Henry all over the country so he could point out many crime scenes. By early 1984, Henry's body count was up to 600. Smelling a rat, Dallas Times-Herald reporter Hugh Ainsworth and Jim Henderson started crunching numbers. They tracked Henry's movements after his release from prison in Michigan until his arrest in Texas. They found pay stubs proving he was in Florida while he was confessing to unalivings in different states. They also found receipts showing that he had donated blood in one state on the same day he was confessing to an unaliving in another state. To commit the crimes he was confessing to, in 1 month he would have needed to drive 11,000 miles in his 13-year-old Ford wagon. In 1985, Hugh Ainsworth and Jim Henderson were nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for this work. A Dallas homicide detective had the same idea and put together a fake murder case that, when shown, Henry promptly confessed to. To get to Henry, you needed to go through the task force, headed by the Texas Rangers, and they were giving Henry the VIP treatment. He was free to roam around the police station with no handcuffs, and was being taken out to eat at restaurants with the task force. All this seems to be very lenient for someone who had confessed to 600 unalivings and claimed to be the world's most prolific unaliver. Henry had already pled guilty to several unalivings by 1985. Then he headed to Waco for a grand jury to indict him on 3 more cases there. Vic Fussell was the district attorney of Waco. He had graduated law school in 1979. 10 days after graduation, he had his first trial, and won. The year before, Vic had successfully prosecuted a triple unaliving that resulted in an unaliving penalty. Vic had been following Henry's case on the news, and he had his doubts. But the real shocker was when the grand jury not only didn't indict Henry, but they also recommended that the task force be investigated. The task force stood by Henry's confessions, stating that they was all accurate. That prompted Vic to write the Lucas Report, which detailed Henry's known locations with pay stubs and other evidence, and compared it to his confessions that he had made. Often, this had contrary information. The Texas Attorney General began investigating claims that dozens of Henry's confessions were worthless. In response to this, the Texas Department of Safety, the FBI, and the IRS began investigating Vic. While he was awaiting trial, he won his re-election, and then he beat his federal case. Then he sued the TV station that made the miniseries about him. He won $58 million. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the Texas Attorney General's report came out. It said that Henry would use information provided to him during questioning by law enforcement personnel to help fabricate confessions. The next year, Vic retired from the prosecutor's office so he could represent Henry in all his cases. Meanwhile, Otis was still in Florida, and his confession spree came into question too, especially the high-profile Adam Walsh case. Otis had already been given the unaliving penalty for the George Sonberg case, and another after he pled guilty to unaliving a 19-year-old woman. Eventually, Otis would plead guilty to 4 more cases and be given life for each of them. Adam Walsh was not one of them. In 1996, Otis died of liver cancer. No one claimed his body, and he was buried in the prison cemetery. This autographed Polaroid picture is one of the last pictures taken of him. By 1986, Henry had been convicted of 10 unalivings, 9 of them in Texas. He had been given the unaliving sentence once, 5 life sentences, as well as 210 years. The unaliving penalty was for the unaliving of an unidentified female hitchhiker. She was called Orange Socks because that's all she had on when she was found. In 1983, Henry confessed to the unaliving of Michelle Boucher in Minnesota, but when he gave the Minnesota State Police inconsistent and inaccurate details, the police eliminated him as a suspect. In 1988, a former Minnesota state trooper who left the state after joining a cult and was already serving 2 life sentences confessed to the crime. In 1984, Henry confessed to the unsolved case of an unidentified woman who was found in New York State. That confession was also disproven because he was in Florida at the time. Later, DNA identified her as Tammy Alexander. DNA was also found on her. The source of the DNA is unknown, but it did not come from Henry. In 1989, the Texas Court of Appeals upheld Henry's conviction for the unaliving of Orange Socks, even though records show that he was in Florida at the time. The next year, the same evidence was used to get him a stay of execution. By 1999, Henry was up to 13 convictions when a curveball came flying in from left field. Becky Powell, Otis's niece, she was still alive, and she was sitting in Vic's office sipping a Coke. The woman was the same weight and height as Becky, but looked older. Drugs and hard living, Becky said as she lit another cigarette. Becky said she had run off with a trucker, just like Henry said, but on the way to Florida she had a change of heart and decided to go home with the trucker and married him. The trucker, Curtis Wilcox, confirmed her story in a video deposition. Becky said she started going by the name Phyllis and took the last name Wilcox when she got married. They lived in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and had 2 kids. Vic had her take a lie detector, and when she passed, he was convinced she was Becky. That is until Vic found the letters Henry had written her with details to tell him. Turns out Phyllis wasn't 27, she was 40, and she lived in Cape Girardeau her entire life. She had read a book about Henry, and then wrote him. Later, she went to Texas to visit him in prison. When Henry met her, he saw how much she looked like Becky, and asked Phyllis to impersonate her. Possibly, the only thing that Phyllis said that was true was that Henry couldn't have committed the Orange Socks case because he was in Florida at the time. George W. Bush was the governor of Texas for 5 years. During that time, he signed 152 death warrants, about 30 a year. Texas executes more people than any other state, and George Bush had the highest execution rate of any Texas governor. But due to overwhelming evidence, Governor George Bush commuted Henry's unaliving penalty to a life sentence in the Orange Socks case. In 2001, Henry was found dead of natural causes in the Ellis 1 unit of a prison in Huntsville, Texas. His body went unclaimed, and he was buried in the prison cemetery. His grave has been stolen and vandalized so many times, it is no longer replaced. Adam Walsh's parents blamed the police for botching their son's investigation. Witnesses said they saw Otis lure Adam into his white Cadillac in the Sears parking lot. First, the police lost the machete that Otis said he used. Then, they lost the car's floor mats that were covered in red DNA evidence. For their final disappearing act, the police lost Otis's 18-foot-long, DNA-stained white Cadillac. To be fair, this was Miami in the 80s. The era of the cocaine cowboys, and because of stuff like Scarface and Miami Vice, I always assumed DNA-stained 18-foot-long white Cadillacs were a completely normal thing to see, but I wasn't there. People started thinking the police had let Otis look at the case file, like the task force was accused of letting Henry do. Otis had confessed and later recanted, something else Henry was known for doing. The Walshes became outspoken critics of the police's handling of the investigation, as well as speaking about their experience. In 1983, a made-for-TV movie called Adam was released. It was based on Adam Walsh's story and was produced by his dad, John Walsh. 38 million people watched the premiere, and the movie was rebroadcast in 1984 and 1985. At the end of the movie, pictures and descriptions of missing children were shown, and a hotline set up. During the movie's 3 broadcasts, 55 children were featured, and 13 of them was found. One of those children was Byron McCain, who had been kidnapped by his mother's ex-boyfriend in Columbus, Ohio. A year and a half later, his babysitter on the Craw Reservation in Oklahoma recognized him after watching Adam. A little bit later in life, he would become Cleveland area rapper Busy Bone. A year after the movie's original release, in 1984, Congress passed the Missing Child Assistance Act, which created the National Center for Missing or Exploited Children. In 1987, Fox began filming a new TV show that would create a national dragnet for wanted fugitives. It was called America's Most Wanted. They already started filming when the producers realized they needed a host. They asked 9 highly qualified candidates, but none of them wanted anything to do with the TV show. During a conference call, John Walter was suggested to be the host. The first episode aired in February 1988, and 4 days later, David Roberts, who had been featured on the show, was arrested. He was a convicted killer who had escaped prison by digging a tunnel. A few years later, in 1991, another unaliver called Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in Wisconsin. Soon after his arrest, his dad called America's Most Wanted hotline and said he believed his son was responsible for what happened to Adam Walsh. In 1981, Dahmer was living in Miami Beach and driving around in a blue delivery van, assaulting young men and boys. Multiple witnesses said they saw him at the Sears the day that Adam disappeared. Adam was 8 years younger than Dahmer's youngest victim, who was 14. But Dahmer had decapitated multiple victims. When asked about Adam, Dahmer said, "I have confessed to 17 crimes. If I had done this, I would have confessed to it too." The case of Orange Socks, which Henry had confessed to, was also featured on America's Most Wanted, but they didn't have any more luck identifying her. In 1994, Walmart began a missing child safety program in their stores in America and Canada. It is called Code Adam. Many more stores began participating, and in 2003, Congress enacted legislation mandating all federal institutions participate in Code Adam. Step 1. If a visitor reports a child missing, a detailed description of the child is taken, specifically the shoe color. Walmart, who developed the plan, said while someone could easily change the child's clothes in their store, it is much more time-consuming to find shoes that fit the child. Step 2. The employee who is alerted of the missing child will page Code Adam on the intercom system along with the child's description. Designated employees will begin looking for the child, while others will monitor the doors. Step 3. If the child is not found in 10 minutes of being reported missing, law enforcement will be contacted. Step 4. If the child is found with anyone besides their guardian, reasonable efforts to delay their departure will be made without putting the child, staff, or visitor at risk. A Code Adam is not over until law enforcement arrives and secures the scene or the child is found. In 2006, former Texas Governor, now President George Bush, signed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, which created the tiered system for the sex offender registry, with the most severe cases receiving the most attention. 27 years after his death, in 2008, the police closed the Adam Walsh case. No new evidence had been found after Otis Toole's death, and he had made a deathbed confession to the crime. Adam Walsh's head was the only part of his body ever recovered, and for 27 years it sat in a freezer in a coroner's office, awaiting a trial that never came. With the case closed, he was returned to his parents and finally laid to rest. Just to be clear, every single time you saw John Walsh host America's Most Wanted, his son's head was in a freezer. In 2016, on the 37th anniversary of her discovery, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released new sketches of Orange Socks. In January 2019, police announced that DNA from 2 unknown men had been found under her fingernails. Neither of the DNA profiles came back to Henry or Otis. Then, in August, the DNA Doe Project found her cousin. Orange Socks finally had a name, Deborah Jackson. Not a lot is known about her, but her family last saw her in 1977, 2 years before she died, and she was never reported missing. On March 17, 1983, a sheriff deputy in Montgomery County, Kansas, not Virginia, found the naked body of a woman burning in a field. She was identified as Laura Purchase, who had been reported missing in Houston, Texas. In 1986, Henry was convicted of this crime. In 2007, the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Division reopened her case. DNA had been found on her in the 80s, and it was sent for testing. That eliminated Henry and Otis as suspects. In 2019, investigators sent the DNA for genetic testing. The investigators found a relative, and 38 years to the day after Laura was found, detectives executed a DNA warrant and collected a sample from the prime suspect, 75-year-old Thomas Darnell. As of this video, he is sitting in the Alcatraz of the Great Plains, aka the Montgomery County, Kansas jail, and he's awaiting charges on a capital case. What Henry did to his mom was bad, but maybe if she'd been a little bit nicer, none of this would have happened in the first place. Then he did what he did to Becky and Kate, and that's worse. But the worst thing that Henry did is the over 200 cases that got closed because of his confessions. He allowed Thomas to live his whole life until the sheriff wheeled him from the nursing home to the prison infirmary. And Thomas is a rarity. Most of these people never spent a day in jail for their capital offenses, and their families never received closure. It's crazy that there was actually 600 open cases for him to cop to in the first place. And as of today, 42% of those types of cases go unsolved. And that is a 151% increase over the past 40 years. Let me tell you about another case that's falling into this 42% category. These kids didn't do nothing to nobody. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and all this time later, their families never gotten closure. Likewise, the person who did it has never been caught, and they're free to do it again. We can debate police policy and tactics all day, every day, but we can all agree what happened to these kids ain't cool. This is a special edition of Montgomery County's Most Wanted. There's a madman on the loose, and the sheriff needs your help to find him. Heidi Childs grew up in nearby Lynchburg. She was one of 8 kids, was homeschooled, and ran cross country in a homeschool league. In 2008, Heidi was one of the fastest runners in the league. At a church youth camp, she met David Metzer, another Lynchburg resident and student at Brookview High School. His father was a doctor, and his family had done missionary work in China.
Both of them attended Heritage Baptist Church, and both of them worked at Frost Mountain Creamery. After graduating high school, they both went to Virginia Tech. David was studying industrial systems engineering. Heidi was on a full financial scholarship. She was an honors student, and she was studying biochemistry. After meeting up again at Virginia Tech, they started dating.
On the evening of August 26, 2009, they had known each other for 4 years and been dating for 1. That night, 19-year-old David drove his dark blue 1992 Toyota Camry to 18-year-old Heidi's apartment to pick her up.
He had found a new hiking trail while he was at a Christian camp called Camp Tuckaway. The camp's a few miles away from Virginia Tech in the Jefferson National Forest section of the county. The trail is at Caldwell Fields on Craig Creek Road, the same road as Camp Tuckaway. Caldwell Fields is named after Addison, Milton, and George Caldwell. Addison Caldwell, he was the first person to enroll at Virginia Tech, and his brother Milton, he enrolled the same day. George Caldwell, he's no relation to them, but he was also an early student at Virginia Tech. They arrived at Caldwell Fields between 8 and 8:30. As the sun was setting, they got out of the car and they walked across the tributary of Craig Creek to a fire pit at Milton Field. David brought his guitar. They lit a fire and he began to play. It's not known how long they stayed before they headed back to the car. Sometime between 8:30 and 10 o'clock, an unknown person or persons approached the couple's car and opened fire. A common hunting rifle was used, a .30-30. David met his maker in the front seat of his car, and Heidi made it a foot or two away before she met hers. Heidi's purse was the only thing taken. It had her cell phone, a digital camera, and her student ID. Police have ruled out robbery as a motive because David's wallet and his guitar was found with him. On August 27, 2009, a man walking his dog down Craig Creek Road happened upon the grisly scene. Caldwell Fields is near a public shooting range, so gunshots are pretty common in the area. Near Caldwell Fields, Craig Creek Road interstates with US 460, the main route between Christiansburg, Virginia and Interstate 81, and Princeton, West Virginia and Interstate 77. Besides being local, the shooter could have been someone traveling down this road looking for a crime of opportunity. The National Forest has a lot of campsites and rental cabins. The shooter could have been someone on vacation.
During the first year of the investigation, police followed up on 1,200 tips while the reward grew to $100,000. The police have been tight-lipped about the investigation, but here's a few things they do know. They do have DNA, but there isn't a match in the system and they don't have any suspects to compare it to. The police are looking for a dark green Honda sedan, which I think at night would probably look like David's car. They're also looking for a dark blue Dodge Caravan, a dark Ford Crown Victoria, or a Chevy Caprice Classic, which is like an old school police style vehicle. They're looking for a red Dodge pickup truck or a gray or cream colored Pontiac Bonneville. If you know anyone who drove a vehicle like that in 2009, and especially if they owned a 3030, call the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department or the Virginia State Police. These families deserve the closure that Henry denied so many. Let's catch this guy before he's like Thomas Daniels, who most likely only has a year or two of life left.
Alright y'all, that's my video and hope you liked it. If you did like it, you need to hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. Don't be watching my stuff for free. If you like this video, here's a couple more videos you might like.